Hi there, my name is Tom Holloway and I'm a lead principal business resilience consultant in Sungard Availability Services EMEA consulting practice. I work with clients in EMEA principally on business continuity and wider organisational resilience issues, including crisis management, exercising and crisis communications. We're recording this webinar today on Thursday, the 4th of June, BC lessons identified during the COVID-19 pandemic. Although Sungard AS is very used to regional emergencies, such as hurricanes in the US East Coast or flooding in India, this has been a global event for our business, with clients occupying all of our workplace recovery sites in 9 countries on 3 continents. And I'll be touching on that aspect a little later. Many organisations have adapted their ways of working over the past few months, with the majority making much more use of digital technology. Returning to the pre-crisis ways of doing business is unlikely to be a good idea. In this webinar, I shall be looking at the lessons businesses have been identifying during the pandemic. Lessons capture is going to be critical in producing better plans, important when you consider that there may be second and third waves of the current pandemic, to say nothing of other potential disruptions. Ultimately, this is about resilience, the ability to absorb a shock and come out of it stronger. In short, to survive and thrive. And resilience is all about flexibility, agility and adaptability. It is probably worth clearing up a small but important doctrinal distinction regarding lessons learned and identified, as it is a common misnomer. Unfortunately, lessons learned implies that all that needs to happen is to reflect and come up with some bon mots about a recent experience, whereas if the learning is not embedded, the organisation doesn't change and the same issues recur next time round. As for definitions, a lesson identified, a recommendation based on analysed experience from which others can learn in order to improve performance on a specific task or objective, whereas a lesson learned, a change in personal or organisational behaviour as a result of learning from experience. So, with no further ado, let's get started. During this webinar, I shall be looking at the following areas: not on the radar, the experience of clients, looking at posture for the new normal, and then concluding. I'll be talking about the importance of horizon scanning, and the point here, not on the radar, is that for many, perhaps even the majority, a pandemic was not a current concern. I will be drawing on the experiences of Sungard clients throughout, looking at the period across 3 distinct phases: initial response, enduring response, and recovery. So starting with not on the radar. The graphic shows a pie chart with the causes of invocations to Sungard workplace recovery sites in 2019. Broadly in line with previous years, we can see that around 80% of invocations are as a result of the boring but important disruptions. These are not the headline-grabbing cyber and security-related events that dominate the news, rather the failure of important components such as power outages, network or comms failure, water leaks, and equipment breakdown. However, as a result of them being common causes of disruption, they are, or at least should be, addressed by business continuity plans. We've shown this extract from the World Economic Forum's annual Horizon Scanning report previously. The chart shows the top 5 global risks in terms of likelihood on top and impact on the bottom for the years 2008, 2013 and 2019. The chart shows 2 interesting things. Firstly, at the global level, that risks creating uncertainty and complexity are increasing, as are those with adversaries in the case of cyber and fraud. The second thing is that we have a short memory for what went before. And I'm just highlighting here, pandemics were on the top 5 in terms of impact in 2008. So expanding the W results beyond the 3 data points that I chose on the last slide, and looking at those top 5 risks between 2007 and 2020 inclusive, you can see that chronic and infectious disease and pandemic appear with some frequency, often in step with outbreaks, such as 2007-2008 with H5N1, and 2015, where we saw MERS, Ebola, and swine flu. Until 2020 and COVID-19, previous virus outbreaks had been relatively mild in their impact, largely regional. However, the containment of those viruses should have served as a lesson not as a cause for overconfidence or embedding a sense of invulnerability to events far away. Now, that's the risk was being ignored. Here we see the UK's National Risk Register 2015, with pandemic flu sitting high in the top right quadrant. More recently, we have the 2019 UK National Security Risk Assessment, again placing the risk of influenza-type pandemic at very high. Now, I am not here to comment on any countries or regions' handling of the crisis, but I do want to make the point at the outset that there was a period of around 2 months before COVID-19 reached Europe and North America. Based on previous pandemic experience, perhaps there was an assumption that it would have a limited regional impact. With 2020 hindsight, we know that that would not be the case. You probably recognize the WHO bar chart showing the number of COVID cases by region over time. And you can see to the right of the bar chart some key dates in the box. The point is that some businesses were using the time to draw up contingency plans to restrict business travel ahead of nationally imposed restrictions, to review third-party suppliers, and the like. And at the same time, many businesses simply followed the daily news agenda, and using the fable of the boiling frog phenomenon, they sought reassurance that the changes in the situation were gradual and not as grave as it turned out to be. So regardless of black swans or boiling frogs, the focus of the next part of this webinar is the experience of Sungard AS clients. Earlier, we've seen 3 fairly distinct phases from a business continuity point of view. The initial response, which was effectively a planned evacuation of offices. The enduring response, how organizations managed throughout lockdown. And recovery, as lockdowns are lifted and staff tentatively consider returning to work in offices. I shall tackle this section thematically under the following headings: business operations, people, premises, technology, information, suppliers, finishing with communications. So starting with business, the majority underestimated the potential impact of COVID-19 and were slow to respond in the early stages. Few organizations had dedicated pandemic plans, instead using existing structures and quickly modified business continuity plans. It is worth noting that BC plans usually assume that you have nothing and are working up to 100% functionality, whereas in the event of a pandemic, you generally start at 100% and come down as staff absenteeism increases due to sickness or caring for others. You should also focus on maintaining critical activities at the expense of less pressing tasks. As the lockdown kicked in, widespread remote working of large numbers of businesses took place. This did not suit all, especially in manufacturing. And evidently you cannot build a car at home, so we have seen automotive clients particularly closing down sites in the face of the stay-at-home mandate, the reduction in demand, and as a consequence of disruption in their global supply chains, more of which later. For those who were able to work remotely, although it's a gross generalization, it is safe to say that productivity will have fallen, especially amongst creative teams that rely on face-to-face interaction. Many organizations, particularly in the creative industries such as games developers and TV production, saw a significant fall in output. Under lockdown restrictions, it was simply not possible to film new content, although it was possible to continue with the final editing of shows, for example. The lockdown implications had a widespread impact on core business, putting many businesses into effectively tick over. In the retail sector, while shops were shut, those with an online presence may have been able to operate at reduced levels. We have seen some innovation around processes. For example, the wider use of soft copy documentation by legal firms instead of a reliance of working on hard copy documents. We had heard that partners would never have previously accepted this, although it would seem that they have. And we expect that many businesses will be evaluating paper-based systems and processes as they go forward. Many organizations we work with have been entrenched in dealing with the business challenges and changes resulting from COVID-19 pandemic, including transition to remote working and closing down of workplaces. Now, having successfully adapted to this situation, there will be a post-lockdown transition back to normal workplaces. This needs to be carefully planned for and closely monitored to minimize disruption to the organization, as well as reflecting the health and safety concerns of your workforce. social distancing, health checks, and temperature screening will be a reality. So whether you are returning to a 2019 normal or to a new normal, your workforce will be anxious to get back to their primary workplaces as a definitive step away from uncertainty and movement towards calmer and more predictable times. We have seen renewed interest in BC and resilience matters amongst senior leadership as a result of the COVID-19 experience. I have read that there's been a spike in the hiring of BC staff in recent weeks, which is good news for all of those watching this webinar, I'd hope. There is more to post-pandemic planning than temporary workforce unavailability and deep cleaning workplaces. All organisations should consider the geographic and functional concentration risks that have come to light during the pandemic lockdown and take steps to reduce their exposure. And the examples there would be workforce, workplace, third parties, suppliers, and data centres perhaps. We are working with numerous clients to capitalise on this executive interest to capture the lessons from the organisation, to launch or update existing BC programmes, or to validate existing frameworks in order to embed resilience within the organisation. Now, it is self-evident that staff are the most important resource of all organisations, and therefore putting in place measures for the protection and well-being of staff was top of the list of things to do. To that end, this was where we saw the earliest adoptions of protective measures as COVID-19 spread across the globe. A number of clients were quick to allow and enable vulnerable staff to work remotely to protect them from having to commute to their normal place of work. Others introduced very flexible working hours with the aim of reducing the exposure of their staff to peak rush hour travel. Travel bans were imposed for non-essential staff, broadly in line with the official advice at the time. Resumption, however, of business travel, both domestic and international, will be a major consideration for most businesses. Anecdotally, with all the uncertainty, we expect to see less travel and greater use of collaborative tools. The subject of home working is huge. A big assumption is that all workers have the ability to work productively at home with suitable facilities and conditions. It also assumes that they have been provided with the necessary hardware. With the best will in the world, sharing the kitchen table with others in the house is not the same as having a proper working environment. Some companies insist on a separate home office, although these are very much in the minority. Where possible, working at home has challenges. Interruptions and distractions from online deliveries, children, pets, or the non-stop WhatsApp messages needs to be managed. Many businesses have provided employees with advice on how to manage their time, encouraging greater flexible working to allow employees to support school-aged children through the traditional working day. For some, however, it's been the opposite. With genuine face-to-face interaction impossible, individual isolation has been the issue. And whilst collaborative tools such as Teams and Zoom and all the rest help reduce the isolation amongst teams used to working closely, they are a poor substitute for the real thing. And they too have been prone to disruption as usage increased suddenly. Latterly, there has been much discussion of the impacts of lockdown on mental health. Many businesses have provided staff with details of existing employee assistance schemes, and I understand that many remote counselling services have never been busier. Our American colleagues talk of the importance of water cooler moments, and we have seen teams on both sides of the Atlantic put in place routine, sometimes daily, although almost certainly weekly catch-up calls. And I've heard of fancy dress days, quizzes, virtual sundowners and the like. I guess whatever works for your team. Perhaps the biggest challenge for organisations is management of their employees when they are remotely spread across many locations. Ensuring that some of the issues I'm describing do not become serious business problems will be a real test of leadership and management. With bosses forced to be more hands-off, that crucial leadership quality, trust, comes into play. This implies a strong culture, and leaders have to set this through excellent communications, which I'll touch on later. Looking at skills and single points of failure, we saw a number of incidents where key BC staff were self-isolating and unable to be present to assist in the planning. This emphasises the importance on robust levels of preparation and an organisation-wide culture of resilience. Considering the return to work, you may wish to delay the return to the office of any genuinely uniquely skilled individuals, and clearly succession planning and training should also be considered. Looking to the return to the office, you should plan for vulnerable staff who may have to continue to work in isolation for longer than the general population. You may also need to address human concerns around returning to the office environment. You may well have staff who are reluctant to come back. Consider instigating one-to-one conversations with staff to identify potential issues and mitigate anxiety. Organisations will also need to consider the management of annual leave. We've heard of a number of businesses that required staff to take holiday that they had already planned to take over the period of lockdown. The other aspect of this is managing annual leave once staff return to the office, unless everyone puts in a 2-week holiday the moment the lockdown is lifted to spend quality time away from home. Looking at premises, proactive employers provided staff with wipes and hand gel early on and also increased the frequency of cleaning. The majority of employers followed government advice, although those that followed the news cycle often found themselves unable to secure sufficient stocks of hand sanitizer and similar products. We've seen an awful lot of split-site working practices enabling increased social distancing. This has been a huge area for Sungard, with all of our workplace recovery sites in 9 countries across 3 continents being occupied concurrently. In the initial phase, to say February and March, we saw many financial services clients occupying their dedicated workplace suites on a reduced capacity using checkerboard seating to enhance social distancing measures and physically separate teams. At least one client I know of took measures to prevent those working at one of our London workplace recovery sites from being able to access the primary office by disabling temporarily access passes. Therefore, teams were segregated physically. Another business split all key teams into thirds, with 1/3 working in the primary office, another at Sungard facilities, and a third working at home. Interestingly, we saw more take-up of our out-of-town recovery sites, allowing staff to drive directly from home rather than have to use public transport. As we approached the imposition of lockdown, we saw many businesses conduct a planned office evacuation. I doubt many took home desks and office chairs before the start of the lockdown period, and anecdotally, I'm sure that we've all heard stories of people straining at their laptops while sitting on their sofas with consequent neck and back issues. So this is a boring but quite important issue. I raised the subject of display screen equipment assessments, as it is unlikely that these have been conducted for the majority of those working from home. Following the announcement of lockdown on the 23rd of March in the UK, we saw a fall in the occupancy of our workplace recovery sites, although some clients did have a requirement for key staff to remain on sites through the period, mostly IT staff and engineers. Many of our clients are now looking at a phased return to the office, synchronized with the resumption of transport links and school openings. We do expect to see an increase in the use of our workplace recovery sites across the estate as lockdown conditions are relaxed, as businesses refocus on split site and split team working to retain that social distancing. You too may wish to consider proactive changes to access controls. Facilities management staff will be looking at servicing key building systems to ensure that after months of inactivity, those key things do not break down after when they come under renewed load. And the same should also apply to printers and copiers and other equipment like that. In technology, in the weeks leading up to the lockdown, we saw many clients conduct large-scale testing of remote working, VPN and VDI. That said, these were often conducted over the weekends, and as a consequence, systems were perhaps not load tested under normal conditions. In the early stages of the pandemic, we saw IT staff working close to 24/7 in some cases to support the move to remote working. In the early phases of the current pandemic, we saw heroic levels of laptop procurement where stocks allowed. Numerous clients procured thousands of laptops in a matter of days, whilst there are others who delayed making the commitment to purchase and found that the stock was no longer available or that the prices had increased significantly. We saw many employers allowing staff to take home monitors, peripherals, and in some cases, PCs home for the lockdown period. This has meant that much project and development work has fallen by the wayside, as IT support staff have focused on enabling BAU as the priority. Whilst the large telecom and network service providers have generally responded well to the challenges, and we've also seen content streaming services and others downgrading their video quality to help alleviate the network problems. That said, it's not all good news on the network front. The shift from office to home working has caused a significant impact on the performance to accessing cloud, on-premises or SaaS applications and data, as well as the added security implications of working remotely. Network speed and latency issues have been a particular issue. We've seen clients with bandwidth bottlenecks at the point of entry to the business's data centers and cloud services, with corporate networks unused to having the majority of their staff connecting via VPN. In response, we've seen many clients hugely expand their capacity, in some cases overnight, to overcome these bottlenecks and to work effectively over VPN. For some, there have been challenges in remoting telephony and call recording amongst contact center teams. We have a card services provider operating from one of our workplace sites, and they've been able to provide reassurance to their clients that call response SLAs will be met and that sensitive client data is not at risk of being compromised by remote working staff. Consequently, they've been winning business from their competition. With many more remotely working staff, cybersecurity and particularly malware was a significant concern for many, as criminals have sought to use coronavirus as cover. Early on, we saw an explosion of COVID-related phishing. For those on corporate devices, this is less of an issue, although those using their own devices should ensure that they have suitable protection. Whilst free downloads are good, cybersecurity you've paid for is better. As the lockdown period has continued, corporate IT staff have been able to address some of these cybersecurity issues, having got over the first hurdle of enabling and supporting increased levels of remote working. Whilst the gaps are closing, phishing attacks and malware do remain a threat. Technical support teams have managed the initial bandwidth spike, adjusted services as much as possible, and are monitoring services very closely. But the question is, what next? Is now or soon the time for planning more flexibility for businesses' bandwidth requirements, assuming that we may not be going back to exactly how it was? How can you easily increase or decrease bandwidth at the data center's entry point? Start looking at bandwidth as a utility, looking to increase the size of the pipe as demand increases. How can you more efficiently prioritize critical data types? And finally, looking at backlog management as organizations begin to return to the office, both non-essential business operations and automated IT updates may have to be temporarily suspended as everyone directly connects to the corporate network. You will need to consider which is the priority and which can wait until operations are more stable. Information. Generally speaking, those that we have engaged with have been able to access their information throughout the pandemic lockdown. Yes, at times, network speeds have been slow, and some enterprise platforms have been overwhelmed for short periods of time. We are aware of isolated latency issues as data travels back and forth across the Atlantic. Accessing data in the complex hybrid compute environments that are now the norm for most organizations relies on a fine degree of synchronization between systems. It should be noted that for the vast majority, systems are up and running. There is power to on-prem comms rooms and data centers. There is network connectivity, and there has not been widespread corruption of data as there was with the NotPetya and WannaCry attacks. Now, should any of these systems, connectivity or data integrity areas have been compromised, organizations will have had a very different experience. Think back to the slide I showed at the beginning, showing the causes of invocation to workplace facilities in 2019. 25% were due to power outages, 18% due to network outages, and there are far more likely disaster situations than the destruction of a data center that require attention. You may see the partial loss of a data center as a result of a power or cooling issues. And of course, there remains the ever-present threat of successful cyber attacks that compromise production and backup data. Earlier, I touched on heightened concerns about concentration risk. You should also consider that the technology teams within a single geography or indeed building, and particularly the recovery teams, also production and DR services with the same provider. Have your recovery team conducted exercises that prepared them for an actual recovery Typically, 75% of our clients we challenge on this topic have material weaknesses. Those hybrid compute environments that we just looked at have particular challenges with data synchronization, whilst maintaining unimpacted production whilst recovering remains a challenge. All of this underscores the importance of DR testing. Many clients have experienced supply chain issues. I read in the US that 94% of Fortune 500 companies experience disruptions to their supply chains. It is vital to consider dependencies both upstream and downstream as part of routine BC planning. We saw the inability of Far Eastern third-party suppliers to continue to provide goods and services impact European businesses. Early on, we saw vehicle manufacturers wrestling with the management of stock levels due to parts shortages, and in some cases having to close plants down because of this. Later, this became more widespread with European and then home-based suppliers unable to satisfy demand. Many are now questioning the suitability of the just-in-time philosophy, which has been driving supply chain thinking since the 1970s. Since then, supply chains have been getting increasingly efficient. We may now see a shift in focus to increasingly resilient. In times of trouble and crisis, we can be overwhelmed with information from official sources, governments, NGOs, and traditional news channels and social media. The COVID-19 pandemic is no exception. In addition to the trusted sources of information, there are numerous other feeds on social media providing all sorts of misinformation. Amongst all this noise, all business leaders have a responsibility to provide clear and relevant information to their staff and those that they work closely with, to provide reassurance and demonstrate that they have robust measures in place to guarantee their business continuity. Senior leadership needs to manage expectation in light of the changes to business processes, and this will be done by communicating with stakeholders. Some generic ones are listed here, although all organizations have specific demands. Looking first at internal comms, we've touched on the need for leadership to provide reassurance to employees. It is worth noting that according to PR company Eagleman's Trust Barometer report, staff are more likely to trust their employers than government officials or journalists. Therefore, as with any crisis, it has been those organizations that communicated clearly and early with their stakeholders, and particularly their staff, which have done well. Many of our clients who activated remote working for staff required staff to understand remote access protocols, instructions for VPN and two-factor authentication, perhaps published contact details of IT help desk and its hours, changes to contact details, sickness reporting, attendance at routine team calls, or virtual meetings all need to be considered. Other stakeholders also need to be considered. Suppliers, as you modify business processes in the face of official advice and direction, what impact will this have on your suppliers and wider partners? Are your suppliers going to meet your business's expectations in the face of disruption? Only close cooperation and coordination will prevent unpleasant surprises here. For customers, how will they contact you? Will your normal contact center staff be working remotely? Will you be operating a reduced service? Is the messaging from websites, social media, and contact centers coherent and up to date? Investors and shareholders, they're clearly going to be interested to understand the implications of your actions. And in highly regulated sectors, whilst there may have been exceptional dispensations to BAU practices such as trading, regulators will seek reassurance that suitably robust compliance measures remain in place. Consider the following building blocks when putting together your crisis comms response. Have a clear, straightforward process in place. Have teams who are prepared, alive to the changes, and proactive in messaging. Communicate quickly and appropriately. Provide links to official information. Your staff trust you to look after them, and you should seek to reassure them in these difficult times. Speak honestly, do not mislead or lie. It will all come out in the end. Consistent, clear, and accurate messaging is essential. Use facts, avoid spreading rumors and speculation. Be human, approachable, and compassionate. Encourage feedback and recognise the pressures being faced by staff as they work remotely. Importantly, listen to what your staff and others are saying. Respond to their questions and address their concerns. Keep track of what is happening everywhere. Monitor official sources of information for changes. Finally, have a regular cadence of communication. Release what is known. Information little and often is much better than too much, too late. And as organisations now plan the return to offices, now is the time for clear communications to staff, setting expectations for staff and employers alike. Moving forward and building on the lessons we've identified regarding planning for the new normal, we have developed a posture approach. People, your pandemic planning must extend beyond a reduced workforce and the requirement to consider an extended duration beyond 30 days. Concentration risk management has emerged as a business priority. Within business critical teams and identified single points of failure, look at knowledge management, succession plans, and documentation of processes. In terms of outlook, horizon scanning is key to ensure that the next disruption is on your radar. Impacts compound the problems that organizations face, so escalate early. Pre-crisis crisis management. How will your leadership team and subordinate incident management and response teams cope on the day? Conduct training and awareness as part of BAU. And be prepared to invoke crisis management teams to plan the organizational response as well as to manage the impact from the disruption. In terms of strategy, inventing on the fly is not as effective as fine-tuning a predefined situational response. Have plans and ensure that they are regularly refined and updated. Business continuity plans are the logical repository for resource unavailability responses. Technology. With Gartner predicting a 20% increase in the numbers of remote working staff from around the 30% currently to near 50%. The push towards scalable, SaaS-based collaborative tools and new ways of working should be a priority. But note as well the concentration risk mitigation certainly applies to IT staff and the physical compute footprint. Urgency. Do not wait for perfect information on which to make decisions. You will miss opportunities for action. Action-orientated decision-making is what you want, not a talking shop. Communication and collaboration protocols and capabilities to generate and enhance situational awareness are important and will aid decision-making tempo. In terms of resilience, organizational or indeed enterprise resilience is the ability of an organization to anticipate, prepare for, respond and adapt to incremental change and sudden disruptions in order to survive and prosper. As touched on at the beginning, it's not just about bouncing back, it is about bouncing forward. And we are all certainly living enterprise resilience now, whether we planned to or not. So you really must look to embed a resilience culture. And enablement. Be in a position to ramp up your response options. So consider workplace flexibility, your access to networks, and the ability to bring on additional compute power. And think about disruptions beyond just future pandemics so that you can respond to a broad range of impacts. Now we've covered a great in the last 30 to 35 minutes or so, so I want to leave you with 4 key areas to consider. Horizon scanning. This is key to business continuity. Consider a wide range of what-if scenarios, such as extreme weather, a resurgence in the pandemic, continued supply chain disruption, and loss of key staff, to name but a few. It is important to develop foresight, which in turn leads to effective responsiveness. If your organization is informed by the daily news headlines, you will be behind the competition. Scalable response. Disruptions take many forms, some highly localized, others with a global impact. The ability to ramp up and down VPN and network access, compute and connection speeds in line with demand should be a serious consideration. Those clients who had invested in agile working approaches and cloud-hosted systems seem to have been those who thrived. I can see that the experiences of many organisations will act as an impetus to transition to cloud quicker than planned. Also, consider workplace recovery, as working from home is not going to suit every disruption. Planning. We say that plans are important, although it is the activity of planning which is the really valuable activity. With up-to-date BC plans, you have the planning data from which to make rapid and perhaps unexpected decisions. And finally, a learning and resilient culture. Instigate a culture where teams are encouraged to learn from their experience, both good and bad. Future performance can only be enhanced if your organisation is willing and able to change behaviour as a result of experience. You may wish to consider reviewing business operations. Can you take forward any of the practices that you have had to employ in recent months into this new normal? You may see greater levels of collaboration with third-party suppliers, perhaps flexibility in payment terms. Clearly, there is no monopoly on good ideas, but working together is certainly a good way of going forward. To close, I would like to hope that there will be a renewed appreciation of business continuity and resilience within all organisations, noting that it is neither an IT nor a facility-specific activity. It is organisation-wide. So, thank you all for listening to this webinar, and I do hope you found the session useful. Or would like to follow up on any of the issues raised today, please do not. The contact details of our regional offices and websites are shown on this slide. We have many resources available to download from the website, white papers, more webinars, and the like. Thank you very much for your time today.